Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony, which today commemorates the 103rd anniversary of the Battle of Pozieres. My name is Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Corporal Jeanette McNeely. On this day, 103 years ago, Australian soldiers entered the Allied offensive on the Somme battlefield in France for the first time. The British Army's losses on the Somme over the previous 3 weeks had been immense. Now it was Australia's turn. On the 23rd of July 1916, the soldiers of the 1st Australian Division assaulted and captured the strongly fortified village of Pozieres. They held the position under heavy German artillery fire before being withdrawn 5 days later, having lost 5,300 men. 2 more Australian divisions were rotated through the battle in turn. Over the following 6 weeks, the Australians made 19 attacks on a narrow 1-mile front. They were subjected to an almost continuous German bombardment of ferocious intensity, greater than anything they had faced before. The constant rain of heavy artillery shells killed, buried, and maimed many soldiers, testing their reserves of courage and stretching their will to the breaking point. The Australians were relieved by the Canadian Corps on the 5th of September and had succeeded in advancing the British front line just over 1.5 miles, and at a terrible cost. Charles Bean later wrote in his official history of the war, "On that crowded mile of summit, the 3 Australian divisions engaged and lost 23,000 officers and men in less than 7 weeks." Tonight, we will tell the story of just one of those thousands of Australians who died in the Battle of Pozieres. We are honoured this evening to acknowledge Mr John King, President, ACT Branch of the Returned and Services League of Australia. We welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. And during this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by visitors and students on behalf of the following schools. From Queensland, Ascot State School, St Peter and Paul School, Bulimba, and Robina State School. Australia's Federation Guard is a tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catapult party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier within the Hall of Memory.
party. Oh! Catapult party, present arms. Catapult party, reverse. Catapult party, rest on.
If you're able, please stand and join in singing the national anthem.
Catapult party, attention! Catapult party, present arms.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is earth by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts, of beauty rich and rare. In history's page let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains then let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Catapult party, shoulder arms. Catapult party, order arms.
Students, you may be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn their loved ones buried in faraway lands. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, flowers of the forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Private Luke Siford. Luke Siford was born in December 1894 in Jarrahdale, Western Australia, the son of Eliza and Luke Siford. He attended Jarrahdale Public School before finding work as a mill hand in the timber industry. In August 1915, Luke Siford enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force. He spent 3 months in Perth completing his initial training before embarking on the transport ship Medic, arriving in Egypt in February 1916. Soon afterwards, the men left Egypt and sailed to France to join the fighting on the Western Front. In France, Siford undertook further training before he joined his unit, the 28th Australian Infantry Battalion, in June. At this time, the battalion was stationed in the Somme sector, carrying out trench raids to capture German prisoners and intelligence. In July, Siford and the 28th Battalion began preparing to take part in a major attack on the German lines at the end of that month. The 1st Australian Division had captured the French village of Pozières in mid-July, but faced repeated German counterattacks and heavy artillery bombardments. The division was relieved by the 2nd Australian Division at the end of the month, of which the 28th Battalion was a member. On the 29th of July, the 2nd Division launched an attack with the aim of capturing the German trenches along the heights northeast of Pozières. Despite an initial British bombardment of the area, the German barbed wire defences were still intact when the division attacked. This was particularly true in the sector assaulted by the 28th Battalion. The men of Siford's unit spent time in the open trying to cut the wire by hand under heavy machine gun and artillery fire. The soldiers fell back into shell holes for shelter, and soon afterwards the 28th Battalion received the order to withdraw. Siford had been struck by machine gun fire in the leg and was badly wounded. He was also suffering the effects of the poison gas released by some of the artillery shells. Lying wounded in a shell hole in no man's land, he was taken prisoner by the Germans. They took him to a casualty clearing station for treatment, but he died of his wounds later that day. He was 21 years old. Luke Siford's family in Australia were informed that he was missing shortly after the battle. Military authorities could not confirm his fate for some time, so the family did not receive news that he had died until 6 months later, in January 1917. After the war, the German cemetery where he had been buried was consolidated, and Siford's remains were moved to the nearby Valley Cemetery, Viser-Nartois, along with 68 other Commonwealth soldiers. His family members had the following poem printed in the newspaper on the anniversary of his death. Somewhere in France, a volley rings, a bugle sounds farewell. A wooden cross, a passing flower, mark where our dear brother fell. Private Luke Siford is listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, amongst more than 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. A photograph of his headstone is displayed today beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Luke Siford, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Catafalque party, shoulder, arms.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Catafalque party, present, arms. Catapult party, shoulder up.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Catapult party, in words, turn. Catapult party, quick march.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Poziere or in the low scrub at Gallipoli with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen and students, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.